By 1975, the Soviet Union had become the most heavily armed state in the history of the world, spending an estimated quarter of its entire gross domestic product on defense, deploying more nuclear warheads than the United States, and commanding a military presence that stretched from the frozen Arctic to the sun-scorched plains of Angola. The man presiding over this colossus was Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev, a former metallurgical engineer from Kamenskoye, Ukraine, who had clawed his way through decades of Stalinist purges and Khrushchev's chaotic reforms to become General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in October 1964. But here is the question that haunts historians to this day. How did a country that appeared so overwhelmingly powerful, so stable, so permanent during the Brezhnev years contain within itself the very seeds of the collapse that would come barely a decade after his death? To understand the peak, you have to understand the man who built it. Brezhnev was not a revolutionary, he was not an intellectual, he was a bureaucrat of extraordinary political instinct, a man who understood that the Soviet system ran not on ideology but on networks of loyalty, carefully distributed privileges, and an unspoken agreement between the ruling class and the ruled. Do not challenge us, and we will give you stability. When he ousted Nikita Khrushchev in a bloodless palace coup in 1964, the Politburo members who backed him were exhausted by Khrushchev's erratic behavior, his wild promises of overtaking America by 1980, his humiliation during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and his relentless reorganizations that threatened every apparatchik's career. They wanted calm, they wanted predictability. Brezhnev gave them exactly that, and in doing so he created something the Soviet Union had never truly experienced before. An era of sustained material comfort for the ruling elite and modest but real improvements for ordinary citizens. The price of this comfort would not become apparent for years. The early Brezhnev period was marked by genuine economic growth. Between 1964 and 1973, Soviet GDP grew at roughly 5% per year, an impressive figure that rivaled many Western economies. The Eighth Five-Year Plan, running from 1966 to 1970, was later called the most successful in Soviet history. Industrial output surged. Consumer goods, long neglected under previous leaderships, began trickling into state stores in quantities that Soviet citizens had never seen. Refrigerators, televisions, and washing machines became common household items for the first time. The number of privately owned automobiles doubled and then doubled again. In 1970, the Volsky Avtomobilny Zavod in Togliatti, a massive factory built with Italian Fiat technology, began rolling out the VAZ-2101, a small sedan that would become the iconic vehicle of Soviet middle-class aspiration. The waiting list for one stretched years, sometimes a decade, but the mere existence of that waiting list represented something revolutionary. Soviet citizens were now consumers, not just workers. If this is the kind of history that pulls you in, the kind that peels back propaganda to reveal the machinery underneath, then this channel is built for you. We dig into the real mechanics of Soviet and Cold War history every week, and subscribing means you will not miss any of it. Now back to 1970, because the picture was about to get much more complicated. Housing was perhaps the most tangible achievement of the Brezhnev era. The massive prefabricated apartment blocks that still dominate the skylines of Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, Minsk, and every major Soviet city were largely products of construction campaigns launched or accelerated under Brezhnev. By the mid-1970s, the Soviet Union was building more housing units per year than any other country on Earth. The apartments were small, standardized, and often poorly constructed, with thin walls and creaking elevators, but they were warm. They had running water, and they replaced communal apartments where multiple families had shared a single kitchen, a single bathroom, and a single telephone in the hallway. For millions of Soviet families, receiving the keys to their own separate apartment, however cramped, was the most significant material improvement of their entire lives. The state provided these apartments free of charge. Rent was nominal, often less than 5% of a worker's salary. This was not capitalism. This was not charity. This was a social contract, and for a time it worked. But here is where the picture fractures if you look closely. The economic growth that powered the early Brezhnev years was not driven by innovation or efficiency. It was driven by brute force inputs: more workers, more raw materials, more factories. The Soviet Union was strip mining its own future. The massive oil and gas fields of Western Siberia, discovered in the 1960s and brought into full production in the 1970s, became the economic lifeline of the entire system. When global oil prices quadrupled after the 1973 Arab oil embargo, the Soviet Union found itself awash in hard currency. Petrodollars flooded the state coffers. For a brief, intoxicating period, Moscow could afford to buy Western grain to feed its people, Western technology to modernize its factories, and Western consumer goods to stock its stores, all while funding revolutionary movements across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The Soviet Union was not just a superpower. It was a petrostate masquerading as an industrial economy. And petrostates, as history teaches us again and again, are only as powerful as the price of oil. The military dimension of the Brezhnev-era peak is staggering to contemplate. By the mid-1970s, the Soviet Union had achieved what its leaders had dreamed of since Hiroshima: strategic nuclear parity with the United States. The arsenal grew from roughly 1,600 nuclear warheads in 1964 to over 25,000 by 1980. The Soviet Navy, historically a minor force, was transformed under Admiral Sergei Gorshkov into a blue water fleet capable of projecting power across every ocean. Submarine bases hollowed out of Arctic rock-sheltered fleets of nuclear-armed ballistic missile submarines. The Soviet army maintained 1.8 million troops in Europe alone, backed by tens of thousands of tanks, a force so massive that NATO planners in Brussels genuinely debated whether Western Europe could be defended at all without resorting to nuclear weapons within days of a Soviet attack. The sense of military invincibility was not just propaganda. It was felt viscerally by Soviet citizens who watched enormous parades roll through Red Square every May Day and every November 7th, the anniversary of the revolution, as columns of intercontinental ballistic missiles on mobile launchers rumbled across the cobblestones beneath the Kremlin walls. And yet, consider this statistic because it reveals the hidden architecture of the entire system. In 1975, the Soviet Union employed roughly 130 million workers. Of those, an estimated 30 to 40 million worked in defense-related industries. Factories that might have produced consumer electronics instead produced guidance systems. Engineers who might have designed better refrigerators designed missile components. Entire closed cities, the so-called secret cities with names like Arzamas 16 and Chelyabinsk 70, existed on no public map and housed hundreds of thousands of people whose sole purpose was weapons development. The peak of Soviet military power was, in a very real sense, purchased with the consumer economy that Soviet citizens were promised but never fully received. The queues that formed outside stores every morning, the empty shelves, the reliance on the black market, these were not failures of planning. They were the direct, calculable cost of empire. Brezhnev himself embodied the contradictions of this era with almost theatrical precision. In public, he was the image of Soviet steadiness, broad-shouldered, heavy-browed, decorated with so many medals that they became a source of quiet humor even among loyal party members. He eventually awarded himself the Order of Victory, a military decoration reserved for wartime commanders, despite his modest wartime record as a political commissar. He gave himself the rank of Marshal of the Soviet Union. He gave himself 4 Hero of the Soviet Union stars, more than any person in history except the fictional composite heroes of wartime propaganda. Behind closed doors, the picture was different. Brezhnev was a man of surprisingly simple tastes and deep personal insecurities. He loved fast cars, hunting, and Western action movies. He kept a collection of luxury automobiles, including a Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow given to him by a British industrialist and a Lincoln Continental gifted by President Nixon. He chain-smoked, he drank, and by the mid-1970s, his health was deteriorating sharply. He suffered a serious stroke or heart attack in 1975, the exact nature of which remains disputed because Kremlin medical records from this period were deliberately obscured. From that point forward, he was increasingly dependent on sleeping pills, painkillers, and the physical support of aides who would hold him upright during public appearances. The most powerful man in the Soviet Union was becoming a medical patient, and the system he had built was designed to ensure that no one could replace him. This was the fatal mechanism of Brezhnevism: stability as paralysis. Brezhnev's social contract with the nomenklatura, the ruling bureaucratic class of roughly 750,000 senior officials and their families, was devastatingly simple. He would not purge them, he would not demote them, he would not reorganize their ministries or challenge their authority. In exchange, they would support him absolutely. The result was that the average age of the Politburo rose steadily throughout his tenure. By the late 1970s, the men running the Soviet Union were almost all in their 70s. They had come of age during the war, risen through the ranks under Stalin, survived Khrushchev, and now clung to their positions with the grim determination of men who knew that losing power in the Soviet system could mean losing everything. Promotion at every level of the party slowed to a crawl. Talented younger officials waited decades for advancement. Corruption, always present in the Soviet system, metastasized into a way of life. In the Central Asian republics, particularly Uzbekistan under Sharaf Rashidov, entire regional economies became elaborate frauds, with cotton production figures inflated by millions of tons to secure bonuses and awards from Moscow. The so-called cotton affair would not be fully exposed until after Brezhnev's death, but the rot was already deep and spreading. The cultural life of the Brezhnev era occupied a strange middle ground between repression and tolerance. This was not Stalinism. Writers were not shot, but they could be silenced, exiled, or confined to psychiatric hospitals. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whose works had been cautiously published under Khrushchev, was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1974 after the publication of the Gulag Archipelago in the West. Andrei Sakharov, the physicist who had helped design the Soviet hydrogen bomb and then turned dissident, was placed under increasing surveillance and would eventually be exiled to the closed city of Gorky in 1980. Yet at the same time, Soviet cinema flourished. Television became ubiquitous. The annual New Year's Eve broadcast became a national ritual, watched by virtually every family in the country. Beloved comedies, adventure films, and war movies produced during the Brezhnev era remain cultural touchstones in Russia to this day. The system did not demand passionate belief. It demanded acquiescence, and for many citizens, especially those with stable jobs, decent apartments, and no political ambitions, acquiescence was a reasonable price to pay. This is the paradox that makes the Brezhnev era so difficult to judge. Millions of people later remembered it as the best time of their lives. The foreign policy achievements of the peak years were real and should not be dismissed. The Helsinki Accords of 1975 represented a high-water mark of Soviet diplomatic legitimacy. 35 nations, including the United States and Canada, signed a document that effectively recognized the post-war borders of Europe, borders that enshrined Soviet control over Eastern Europe. For Brezhnev, Helsinki was a triumph. It was international ratification of everything the Soviet Union had fought for in the Second World War. The borders of Poland, of East Germany, of Czechoslovakia, of all the satellite states were now recognized not just as facts on the ground, but as elements of international law. What Brezhnev did not anticipate, and what almost no one in the Kremlin anticipated, was that the human rights provisions buried in Basket 3 of the Helsinki Accords would become a weapon in the hands of dissidents across Eastern Europe. Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia, the Helsinki monitoring groups in Moscow and Kiev, the Solidarity movement in Poland, all of these would trace their legal and moral authority back to a document that Brezhnev himself had championed. The seeds of 1989 were planted in 1975, and the gardener was the Soviet General Secretary. The space program remained a source of immense national pride. The Salyut space stations, beginning with Salyut 1 in 1971, gave the Soviet Union a lead in long-duration spaceflight that it would maintain throughout the Brezhnev era and beyond. Cosmonauts spent weeks and then months in orbit, conducting experiments, enduring isolation, and demonstrating that the Soviet Union remained a technological civilization of the first rank. The Apollo-Soyuz test project of 1975, in which an American Apollo capsule docked with a Soviet Soyuz capsule in orbit, became a global symbol of détente. Brezhnev and Nixon, and then Brezhnev and Ford, met repeatedly. Arms control agreements were signed. Trade expanded. For a brief window in the early to mid-1970s, it genuinely appeared that the Cold War might be winding down, that the two superpowers had found a way to coexist. This was the moment of maximum Soviet confidence, maximum Western uncertainty, and maximum danger, because confidence bred overreach. The overreach came in December 1979, and it shattered everything. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was not a sudden decision. It was the culmination of months of agonized debate within the Politburo, driven by fears that the pro-Soviet government in Kabul was collapsing, that the revolution was being lost, and that American influence might fill the vacuum. The decision was made by a tiny circle: Brezhnev, already deeply unwell, Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov, an old guard military industrialist, Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, the stone-faced diplomat who had served every Soviet leader since Stalin, and KGB chief Yuri Andropov, who would later succeed Brezhnev. Alexei Kosygin, the pragmatic premier who had opposed intervention, was overruled. On December 24, 1979, Soviet airborne troops began landing at Kabul airport. Within days, special forces had stormed the presidential palace, killing Afghan President Hafizullah Amin and installing a more compliant leader. The initial military operation was textbook. What followed was a catastrophe that would last nearly a decade, cost the lives of over 15,000 Soviet soldiers, and drain billions of rubles from an economy that could no longer afford the expense. The international reaction was immediate and devastating. President Jimmy Carter withdrew the SALT II arms control treaty from Senate consideration. The United States boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics, an event that the Soviet Union had spent billions preparing for as a showcase of national achievement. 65 nations joined the boycott. The gleaming new sports complexes, the freshly paved roads, the carefully curated image of Moscow as a modern, welcoming capital were all rendered hollow. Soviet athletes won a record number of medals, but the stadiums were half empty, and the triumph felt like a funeral. Détente was dead. The Cold War entered its most dangerous phase since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Inside the Soviet Union, the economic cracks that had been papered over by oil revenues were widening. Agricultural production remained a chronic disaster. Despite massive investment in the agricultural sector, the Soviet Union was importing 30 to 40 million tons of grain per year by the early 1980s, much of it from the United States, its principal geopolitical adversary. The irony was almost unbearable. The world's largest country by area, with some of the richest agricultural land on the planet, could not feed itself. Consumer shortages worsened. The joke currency of the late Brezhnev era was not the ruble but the connection, the blat, the personal relationship that allowed you to obtain a pair of imported jeans, a good cut of meat, or a place in a decent hospital. The black market, officially non-existent, was estimated by some Western analysts to account for as much as 20% of economic activity. The planned economy was being quietly hollowed out by its own citizens. And then there was the matter of Brezhnev's health, which by the early 1980s had become a kind of dark national performance. He appeared on television reading speeches from prepared texts, slurring words, losing his place, his jaw slack. Western intelligence agencies debated whether he was still making decisions at all. The Soviet public watched in a mixture of pity, dark humor, and growing anxiety. An entire genre of political jokes, the anecdote, flourished around Brezhnev's condition. In one, Brezhnev opens a Central Committee meeting by pulling out a piece of paper and reading aloud, "Dear Comrade Brezhnev." He pauses, looks up, and says, "Wait, this is the wrong speech. I've been reading a letter to myself." These jokes were not just humor. They were a form of underground political commentary, a way of acknowledging what everyone could see but no one could say publicly. The leader was failing, the system was stagnating, and no mechanism existed to change course. Brezhnev died on November 10, 1982, at the age of 75. He had ruled for 18 years, longer than any Soviet leader except Stalin. His funeral was broadcast on Soviet television, a solemn, ritualized affair with military honors, eulogies, and the interment of his body in the Kremlin wall. In the footage, you can see the pallbearers struggling with the heavy coffin, and at one point, they stumble on the steps and nearly drop it. The coffin lurches. There is a terrible audible thud. For many who watched, that moment became an unintentional metaphor for everything that had gone wrong. What followed was the so-called era of funerals. Yuri Andropov succeeded Brezhnev, brought a brief flicker of reform-minded energy, and died 15 months later. Konstantin Chernenko succeeded Andropov, was visibly ill from the moment he took office, and died 13 months after that. 3 general secretaries dead in less than 3 years. The gerontocracy that Brezhnev had carefully maintained had produced a succession crisis of almost absurd proportions. Only when Mikhail Gorbachev, at 54, the youngest Politburo member, took power in March 1985, did a new generation finally reach the top. And Gorbachev, inheriting the accumulated debts of the Brezhnev era, the military overextension, the economic stagnation, the technological backwardness, the ideological exhaustion, would attempt reforms so radical that they would inadvertently destroy the very state he was trying to save. The Brezhnev-era peak is one of the great illusions of the 20th century. It was real in the sense that Soviet power was vast, that nuclear arsenals were enormous, that influence extended across the globe, and that ordinary citizens lived in greater material security than at any previous point in Soviet history. It was an illusion in the sense that none of it was sustainable. The economy was addicted to resource extraction. The political system was incapable of self-correction. The military consumed resources that the civilian economy desperately needed. The ruling class had traded dynamism for security, innovation for stability, truth for comfort. The peak was not a plateau. It was, viewed from the distance of history, the long, slow beginning of a fall. There is something deeply instructive about the Brezhnev era for anyone watching the modern world. Stability is not the same as strength. A system that cannot tolerate criticism cannot correct its own errors. A leadership class that prioritizes its own survival above all else will eventually consume the institution it was built to protect. The Soviet Union under Brezhnev looked invincible. Its missiles were real, its armies were real, its space stations orbited overhead. But beneath the surface, in the empty shelves, in the falsified production reports, in the slurred speeches of an aging leader reading from a script he could barely see, the future was already being written. It just took the rest of the world another decade to read it.